Thank you, Reba.
Thank you. Marion, I hope rather an investigation between all of us than a sermon, but I get the point. Today's parasha, I think I've already explained, there's three major stories. The most difficult one is the one I'm not going to avoid, and that is the peculiar, unbelievable red heifer story. And so I'd like to look at this with you briefly. The command of the para aduma, the red heifer, with which our parsha begins, is known as the hardest of mitzvot to understand. The opening words Zat Chukat HaTorah are taken to mean as a supreme example of a law, but most people avoid this. We don't understand it, and particularly not in our era. As you heard me read, it was a ritual for purification of those who'd been in contact with a dead body. A dead body was seen as the primary source of impurity, and it was so important that any person who'd come near a dead body could not enter the precincts of the tabernacle unless cleansed in this unbelievable process that we read about, this finding of a single cattle with absolutely no blemish, whose color was red and who had never been yoked. So it represents the purest of nature. Now, and if remember that a person who had been so defiled by coming into contact with a dead body, after they'd been purified with all these ashes from the red heifer, had to go away for 7 days and then come back and be reaccepted. This ritual, thank God, has not been practiced since the days of the tabernacle. It nonetheless remains important and very difficult to understand. One of the ways the rabbis looked at it is, okay, we can't understand it, doesn't matter, just accept it, finished. It's from Hashem, it's not understandable. However, Maimonides, a favorite of everyone, including myself, refused to accept this view. He believed that no divine commandment or command was irrational. And he said that was to presume God was inferior even to a human being. The chukim, that is this, there are three types of these laws, only appear to be inexplicable, perhaps because we didn't live in the era in which these people came from. We didn't understand what pagan practices and peculiar happenings had surrounded them and which they practiced before Abraham and with Moses, our nation and the birth of our Jewish practices. So let's see what they were. These appear to be inexplicable because perhaps we've forgotten the original context. Each of them was a rejection or an education against some idolatrous practice. For the most part, these practices have died out. How then can we still make sense of this story of the burning to ashes of the red heifer, combining it with cloth, etc. Now, there was a third view I'd like to share with you because I trust you find this as fascinating as I do. Nahmanides in the 13th century, and further Samson Raphael Hirsch found a completely different explanation, one that really has appealed to me. He said that the laws are designed to teach us the integrity of nature. For example, when you look at what you had to do in the burning of this red heifer, which is very difficult, by the way, to find a red heifer, it is and you don't combine animal wool and vegetable linen, and you don't mix milk and meat. So there are 3 Chukat, 1 with a red heifer, 1 if you touch a dead person, 2, you're not allowed to wear wool from an animal and linen textiles from vegetables or from chaff, and you can't mix meat and milk, because milk represents life and meat represents death. You're eating dead meat. Isn't that fascinating? The red heifer, Hirsch says, is a ritual to cleanse human from depression brought about by the reminder of their own fear of death by seeing another dead person. I think that is amazing. So these rituals of not combining life and death, milk and a dead animal, and the ritual of having been near a dead body is actually indication of the most profound fear that you and I have. What is the greatest fear we have? Isn't one of them the fear of death? And how do we deal with that? And so in many rabbinical treatises, a few have felt that this whole ritual with the red heifer is to help us get over A, the loss of a loved one, and B, the terrible fear that arises in us when we hear of someone else's death, a loved one, a friend, an unknown person. So it's, a French philosopher even said, neither the sun nor death can be looked on with a steady eye. Few have explored death and the tragedy it casts over the life of those that have come into contact with it. So I thought we should have a look at this red heifer story, because that allowed the person a way of separating themselves from the dead and then being away for 7 days. In this fear of death, the red heifer is to be understood. The animal itself being red represents blood, the color of blood, the essence of life. The cedar represents nature and vegetable life and growth. And the hyssop, the cloth, symbolizes purity. So when all of these are reduced to ashes and then sprinkled over someone who has recently or has touched a dead person, it is just a way of helping us get over that tragedy. So I'd just like to say that this is what the rabbis today think, and particularly the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, of such blessed memory. He concluded that Hashem passed down this ritual to us, which we don't practice today, but the 7 days we do practice. We go into 7 days of mourning. That's what the person did then when they touched a dead body, maybe of a loved one, maybe someone they lost. But they had to go through a process of getting over that death and not wanting to die themselves, or not of seeing someone else die. We immediately are scared of our own mortality. So I thought this was really a fascinating insight. And today that entire ritual, thank God we don't do it anymore, but it's come to us in this modern age, in the 7 days mourning, that we have to sit Shiva 7 days. So that is exactly where it comes from. So I thought that was something I would like to share with you, because with that ritual in those olden days, which came out of that era of sacrifices of animals, etc., we've been left today with the 7 days, a ritual which brings us back to Hashem, to the belief that there is life for us ahead, and to the belief that there is something more than just death, and then it's the end. And so, in the 7 days we should sit Shiva, mourning, we are comforted by others, and thus we are reconnected with life and with Hashem, and our hope still in staying alive, and perhaps using the loss of a loved one to, as many people have done, let me give you an example. The most beautiful example I can think of in today's world is the circle of parents in Israel and Palestine, Palestinians and Israeli parents whose children have been killed by the other's army or snipers. And they've got together in memory of their children and in memory of the great Hashem that gave birth to all the Abrahamic nations, Jew, Christian, Muslim. And in the memory of those children, they are now asking the world for peace. They are begging for a way for peace. And therefore, they've turned the tragedy of the loss of a child, which I cannot even bear to think of, and they've turned that into a blessing and still continue to believe in the goodness of Hashem, in humanity achieving that goodness and leading to reaching out to the other. And I thought that was something very extraordinary that I found. And there's just one other thing I'd like to mention. We had a magnificent drosha last night from Rabbi Benjamin, who told us how amazing a woman Miriam was in that era. But there's another yet interpretation I would like to share with you, because these are two great parallels which show how human Judaism is, how our rituals are there to comfort us, how even in the parallel with war with which this drosha ends, here is a human being who is rejected by his brothers and blamed for the fact that his father gave birth to him by sleeping with a whole lot of prostitute. And yet, look at that same person who was degraded and denigrated and thrown out was called back and became a great, great leader of our people and led our people to victory, as did Moses in the concluding parasha. So let's quickly just look at that too. Look at the humanity of Judaism, how it shows no matter what your birth is, no matter what happened to you, provided you retain faith in doing justice yourself and walking the good path. Just like Joseph, you'll come back. There'll be a time for you that Hashem will show that in his eyes, you are perfect. Never mind what is in humanity's eyes. And last but not least, let us look at Moses. Moses is the greatest human story we've ever known. He was the greatest prophet. Many people have rejected, and the rabbis, as I do, the simple fact that Moses hit the rock and God denied him entrance. The truth is, Moses could not lead the people. A young person, Joshua, had to do that, who had a different type of energy, because after they got to the promised land, there was no more miracles. God did not intervene on behalf of the Jewish people. That miracle ended with Moses. However, with Joshua, a new era begins when God shows us the miracle of giving humanity, the Jewish people, the ability to overcome adversity themselves. So Joshua was a new type of leader that led to a great nation in a brand new land where they had to face the most unknown dangers, having faith in the ability that Hashem gave them to achieve the miracles of a land flowing with milk and honey and overcoming enemies. But the rabbis now have come to a different conclusion, or some rabbinical thought, I would say. Why did Moses get so angry? Because before, they had also wandered in the desert and he'd struck the rock and he wasn't angry. But this time he got very, very angry and he shouted at the people before he struck the rock. And this now is another great lesson for us, because you'll remember the following. And I read this to you just before he got very angry, shouted at the people, blamed them, was furious with them, and hit the rock in anger, which he had never done before when he was told to hit the rock. So the text I read to you gives us a clue as to Moses' humanity. But it's so simply put, it's so easy to miss. In the chapter, this is what I read to you. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived in the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. Now comes the most important words. There Miriam died and was buried. There was no more water for the community. So, in this, rabbinical thought now believes that it was this horrific loss of Miriam, his elder sister. Without Miriam, there would have been no Moses. She was the one who organized, as we heard last night from Rabbi David, the entire history of Moses, managing to save him, get his mother to be a witness, Pharaoh to adopt him, all the rest of the story. Can you imagine how Moses felt that straight after the death of his sister, and this is what the Torah is telling us plainly, the people start to complain, and he speaks to God and he hits that rock with emotion, with the emotion that as a human being he felt at the loss of a great sister, a person who had been helping him lead the Jewish people, the one he could turn to, the one who gave him advice. So I think that this is something I just wanted to bring out in addition to the magnificence of Miriam, his sister. Moses knew he owed everything to her. So it was not simply the Israelites' demand for water that led Moses to lose control of his emotions, but rather his own deep grief. Now we can understand what happened. The Israelites may have lost water, but Moses had lost his sister, who had watched over him as a child, guided his development, supported him throughout the years, and helped him carry the burden of leadership in her role as a leader of the woman. So I thought this would be a good place to conclude, because Judaism is incredible. It uses real human beings' lives, the greatest prophets. All of them were real human beings like you and me. They had emotions like you and me. And they could make terrible mistakes in an emotional moment. Or they could fail. Or they could just be condemned by other people. And yet, Hashem had a great, great place for them, as he has for all of us. This moment reminds us of words from the book of Judges by Barak, who at a later stage was a judge, and said to Deborah, who was also a judge and a prophetess. And Barak says to Deborah, if you go with me into battle, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I cannot go. How can we think that the Torah doesn't value equally woman. In an age where women were still considered chattels, the whole Torah can't suddenly go against that out of its age. We heard that earlier on. But yet here, with Miriam and Deborah, is another example of women who didn't accept themselves the norms of the people around them, and they broke the barrier. And that's what Hashem is telling us about. And that's what got me all excited again today. So the relationship between Barak, the judge, and Deborah, a judge, led men into battle. Come on. God can do no more than wait for the people themselves to break the barriers, as they always have since the beginning of time, as we can see. And with Madame Curie discovering radium and being the first woman at any university ever, because women weren't allowed to study. So for me, the prophetic lesson here is that God has given us all these incredible examples. The example of Moses, who was emotional and did something wrong, as we all do out of emotion or grief at times. And yet he's the greatest prophet than ever lived. And Miriam, you heard last night, a great leader. So bereavement leaves us feeling vulnerable. And if our great heroes, our great prophets, our great leaders, Moses, Miriam, Deborah, Barak, a judge, and others can give us this example, and the beautiful story of Nepath, the son of a prostitute who became a great leader. So this is the lesson that I've received from this Torah today, that each of us, irrespective of disadvantages we may perceive we have, or irrespective of mistakes or failures, we will always have faith that in spite of everything, in spite of this pandemic, and the tragedy of losing loved ones, the tragedy of seeing people die who haven't even caused it, but are part of a world in which we are all one, we can still be here, those of us, to thank Hashem for giving us these insights, and above all, to keep what is at the heart of humankind's survival as we learn to walk in justice, and that is emunah, faith in the future, that in spite of all these things happening around us, that humanity will learn to respect each other, not to kill and smuggle and with greed wildlife, which has resulted in this pandemic. And ultimately, that people will be as Moses, as Deborah, as Nepath, that we can all walk together in peace. Shabbat Shalom.